In part one of this brain snack, I showed you guys the specific brain regions most heavily involved in racial bias and racist behaviors. We saw how heightened threat perception and activation in the disgust zones of the brain are responsible for some of the most vile and racist behaviors that human beings exhibit towards each other. But if these behaviors are wired in the brains of racists and based on human tendencies that we all share, like grouping ourselves based on commonalities, can anything meaningful be done about them? Is it possible to unlearn racial bias and in so doing unravel the wrangling hold that it has on our society? The answer is yes. So let's find out how. Real quick, think of your favorite snack. Let's see, No, not your favorite brain snack. I'm talking about food. The healthy me almost said almonds, but if I'm being honest, I love cupcakes. It's just so cute and small and lickable. There's no way you look at a cupcake and not just feel instantly better about life. When I think of cupcakes, a pretty clear and pretty positive image comes to mind. This image is known as a schema, and it's based on all of my experiences with cupcakes. From the very first experience when I learned what it was called and what it tasted like, to the one too many experiences that I've probably had in my lifetime. We form schemas for everything, especially people. But because our experiences with everything and everyone is limited, the schemas we form are often incomplete or flat out wrong. If I told you to close your eyes and think of a carrot, I'm willing to bet something like this comes to mind. Unless you're a farmer, your schema of carrots likely doesn't include these, or these, or these. But every one of these are carrots. And just like that, I've broadened your schemas of carrots. You're welcome. But unless you consistently see purple carrots in your everyday life, the boring orange ones will probably always come to mind when you hear that word. Okay, so what do carrots and cupcakes have to do with racial bias? A few things. For one, racism is 100% learned. Just like any other association, the brain learns things based on experience, environment, and repeated exposure. If positive words, images, and experiences are associated with a particular person or group of people, it's very unlikely that your amygdala would fire off every time you see it. Second thing, the people with the strongest racial prejudice in this country are those whose brains have the most limited, inaccurate, or incomplete schemas of people from different races. They never or hardly ever come in contact with information or people that change or broaden their schemas about the world. If you look at a map of the most segregated places in the United States, you'll notice that it almost mirrors a map of the number of hate groups across the country, as well as a number of police shootings of Black civilians. Seriously, look this up. It's depressing. The United States is becoming more and more diverse, but remains highly segregated, which sort of bakes racism into the fabric of our society. The third thing is that the brain is plastic, which means that schemas can be changed or broadened. Negative associations can be weakened, or in some cases eliminated altogether. But it all depends on the experiences and environments that we repeatedly expose our brains to. So, the first step of not being racist is taking a long, hard look in your neurological mirror and acknowledging that you are either racist or hold racial biases. Studies show that humans are notoriously bad at recognizing their own biases. Not surprising considering that they're largely unconscious. But it's important to realize to be human is to be biased. We all grew up with parents, teachers, and TV screens that pushed our perspectives in one direction or another. Using psychological assessments like the implicit association test or the intercultural development inventory can help you uncover some of these biases. But honestly, much of this work is being investigative and introspective. It's learning as much as you can about others, but more importantly, about yourself. Asking yourself questions like, how do I feel when or after I talk to a person of color? What surprises me about their personalities or abilities? What things challenge what I thought I knew about them? What assumptions did I make before I did? Where did those assumptions come from? As a parent, this involves talking to your kids about race, asking them similar questions, which studies show a majority of parents suck at doing. I recently learned that Mexico is a more highly educated country than China. Yet, a majority of Americans, I have had this long-held belief in the almost innate academic prowess of Chinese and Asian people, as compared to Mexicans and pretty much everybody else. Without careful consideration of the unique cultures and immigration histories of these different groups of people, and without being deeply reflective about my own incorrect bias, I might have held on to that belief forever. And that's scary. Second step, once you recognize that bias, do your best to hack your brain and weaken the negative associations it makes with certain groups of people. This can be really tricky. For one, our society is saturated with negative stereotypes about people of color and often lacks positive or neutral associations to counter them with. And because if you're an adult, these associations have likely been crackling below your consciousness for decades, probably since you started preschool. Studies show that most racial bias is learned and internalized before the age of 8, and children learn social categories categorization at lightning speed, especially if it involves fear. Look at how fearful kids around the country right now are of police. And learning these negative and fearful associations early on is a double whammy, because as a kid, you lack the power of a fully functional prefrontal cortex to keep your deeper, scarier, and more irrational limbic system in check. But it can be done. People and parents can be intentional about constructing complete and accurate schemas about the world and the people in it. You can weaken negative associations by questioning or challenging negative stereotypes that you encounter, especially those presented by people closest to you, by finding and magnifying examples of counter stereotypes and not consuming all of your media from one news source, Fox News, and by fostering a variety of relationships with people of different races. And no, I'm not talking about that one black friend you got. That one black friend can actually work against your efforts to be anti-racist if you see them as an exception to some perverse or overarching rule. The key is to broaden your racial perspective as much as possible so that your brain struggles to make any singular association with an entire group of people based on superficial traits like race. Lastly, ask yourself, I wonder what kind of ice cream they like.
Ben & Jerry's out.
Remember those little mental boxes that I mentioned in video 1? One hallmark of racism and categorizing ourselves is that we tend to view us's as individuals with personalities and families and hobbies, and we view thems as simple, homogenous, and interchangeable. And we often scan the world in ways that support these overgeneralizations. From ancient Rome to imperial China to the antebellum South to the one percenters of today who believe that your poverty is your fault, the elite have always used this natural tendency to justify systems that have oppressed slaves and the lower class. Well, you can challenge this tendency that we all have to homogenize people in our outgroup. You can imagine what kind of ice cream they like. If they're a cat person or a dog person, you can take their perspective, if only momentarily, on an issue that you think you might disagree on. You can see them as individuals and challenge yourself when negative stereotypes come to mind. The point isn't to embrace your enemies. If people do and say things that are wrong, it's important to take a stance. The point is to prevent your brain from making broader assumptions about people that you simply don't know, especially based on traits that are immutable. Now, I'll be honest, you might hate doing this at first because it's extraordinarily difficult for most people. But you ain't most people, are you?